The U.S. Department of Defense said there's an emergence of a new breed of extremist militants coming from the terror group ISIS. Now, to talk about this in more detail is our foreign affairs expert, Lisa Daftari, who joins us once again from Los Angeles. Lisa, the Pentagon is basing this on dangerous conditions that have developed in both the Middle East and Africa, allowing the terror group to become a significant power.
Yes, well, when we take our eyes off of the target, of course, they're going to grow, take advantage of the political vulnerabilities in these areas in Africa and in the Middle East. Before ISIS was basically in Syria and Iraq. Now they have, of course, expanded their territory. And remember, ISIS is a one off type of terror organization, meaning they never were a huge terror organization in terms of numbers, but their goal was always this do it yourself type of terrorism, meaning trying to find recruits in the United States, in Europe, all over the world, and to say if you take out one Western person, you automatically become a martyr. Whereas if you compare it to the Al Qaeda terror organization, they go for large scale terror surprises like 9/11, and we had reports last month on the foreign desk that Al Qaeda is back at it again, trying to reconvene and trying to plot attacks that are revolving around airplanes again. So these are where we have to stay ahead of the threats. If this threat is coming through the Pentagon, I assure you, Hal, it's too late, meaning they have already grown to a level where we need to now backtrack and figure out how to play defense instead of offense. Let's play offense and get rid of them before they even have the opportunity to sprout up in these areas. Let's not leave these political vacuums and these vulnerabilities to allow these terror organizations to grow and flourish.
Like how you talk about offense and defense, especially NFL playoffs about to get underway here. Lisa, there are some serious concerns in Congress that some of the U.S. humanitarian aid will actually make its way into the hands of terrorists. Can you explain?
Right. So the Biden administration is rolling back some of these boundaries that they have on humanitarian aid. And because of these definitions, if you will, are more lax now, we're able to see different organizations and humanitarian groups give this aid to groups that do not deserve them, especially when it's American taxpayer money getting into the hands of, for example, terror organizations, groups that are maybe working together with the Taliban or the Iran regime are two examples of where it has landed, or the pay for slay program with the Palestinians. The Trump administration was very, very, very hawkish on letting that our American taxpayer money get into the hands of those sympathizers. But yet again, the Biden administration now rolling back these basically guidelines, allowing this money to get into the wrong hands. And that is why we are seeing some lawmakers sound the alarm on rolling back these safeguards that are currently in place.
Lisa, Prince Harry's new memoir is drawing the ire of many in Afghanistan following his claim that he killed 25 Taliban fighters while he was posted with the British forces in the country.
Yeah, I mean, talk about the guy who says he doesn't want to be in the limelight, and yet he's trying to get every headline he possibly can. I mean, who's had enough of Prince Harry already? I think all of us have. Yes, so comes out that he was basically fighting Taliban fighters. Now the Taliban has put basically a target on UK soldiers, saying they want to basically gain revenge for what Prince Harry is claiming in his book. Look, there's no such thing as bad publicity for Prince Harry and his wife going around. They have thrown everyone under the bus, including obviously their own family. These are the ways that they're becoming relevant, really being tabloidy, really being, reality television relevant, trying to get out there. And of course, I think a lot of people are just very turned off by their approach on all of this. And now we have the Taliban going after them and the UK. So they've turned this into a global conflict of some sort, but hopefully it will all go away very soon.
A woman from Alabama who allegedly joined ISIS at the age of 20 back in 2014 had a baby with one of its fighters in Syria and says she hopes to return to the United States, serve prison time if necessary, and advocate against the extremists. Lisa Hodamothana says she was simply brainwashed.
Obviously she was brainwashed, but thank you, Hal, for bringing this full circle. We just talked about ISIS and how they try to recruit people from their basements, from their comfortable lives here in the United States. I mean, think about a human being who is able to be so brainwashed that they leave their lives, their normal, democratic, freedom-loving lives here in the West, whether it be in Canada, the United States, or Europe, and go off to fight for ISIS. They have an ISIS baby, and of course, then have buyer's remorse, and they realize how wonderful the West is and how they want to come back. And now she's willing to pay the time to do so. But there has to be some sort of extreme vetting in these cases. Obviously, she should be brought to trial and brought to justice. But are they really telling the truth, or will they only bring their entire network of terrorism here to the United States or to Canada or to Europe to only operate and have a base here? We have to be extremely careful. Obviously, she has buyer's remorse. Obviously, she was brainwashed. But again, I want to go back to my original point of starting, or kind of catching this before it starts. When we see so many threats, I remember back in 2014 when ISIS came onto the global stage, finding these kinds of recruitment posts on Telegram and WhatsApp and Facebook more than anything else, 2014, and bringing it to the attention of authorities at these companies, and a lot of times having it just fall by the wayside where these threats are not taken seriously. Of course, now we see where social media's head was at the time, and not really going after these terrorists. But again, let's catch them before they get so-called brainwashed, before they get recruited, before they go over to Syria and to Iraq and anywhere else that they are fighting for ISIS, alongside ISIS and with ISIS.
And you're right, absolutely. Especially some of the refugees we're bringing in now. Vetting will be key, definitely. Lisa, Iranians across North America and Europe show their solidarity for Iran's protesters over the weekend, with large crowds that gathered here in Canada, where you are in the U.S., Germany, and Sweden. The protests against the Islamic Republic have continued unabated for 4 months since 22-year-old Mahsa Amini was killed at the hands of the Iranian government and their morality police. Lisa, the revolution continues.
It does continue, and the people are so courageous to continue coming out when they see the executions happening. Imagine these young people that are being rounded up solely for their peaceful protesting, and then they are executed. We had two very prominent young men executed over the weekend, and the list of executions occurs. When we reported just a month or two ago about 15,000 of these young protesters being on death row and the potential for them to be executed, the mainstream media actually came out and said, no, this is a lie, it's not true. And then when you look, juxtapose that when this is happening in real time, I mean, what will the world do? Will the global community stand back and wait for that death toll to hit 15,000 before they offer support to Iran's protesters? And to your point, of course, the expat community, the Iranian Americans, Canadians, Europeans, and those who support them were out on the streets this past weekend offering support and solidarity, marching side by side their Iranian compatriots and those who they support back in Iran, and trying to bring attention to government bodies to support this revolution. Impose proper sanctions, enforce those sanctions. It's not just lip service. We want them enforced. Step away from any deals that will normalize relations with Iran's regime, and of course to come out and support regime change. This regime being gone will only be better for the entire world community, national security, global security, and of course the people of Iran who are asking for our help.
So how close are we to actually seeing Iran's regime potentially being overthrown?
The people are out on the streets. That's the main ingredient here. But we do need global support for this. They can't do it alone. Think about it, Hal. They don't have weapons. They don't have any means of organization other than themselves. They're rolling up their sleeves and coming out onto the streets. But they do need the world communities. They do need the United States, the European powers, Canada, everyone to be on board and to enforce this policy. Until the Western world decides that they want to follow a policy of regime change, it's not going to happen alone. But the Iranian people are saying, if you're not going to help us, at the very least, don't stand in our way. Don't normalize relations with Iran's regime. Don't water down the sanctions. You have to help us out. And of course, again, it will only help everyone involved here if the world community decides to enforce these sanctions, to support regime change, and to get rid of the largest supporter of global terror.
Now, speaking of protests, Lisa, supporters of former Brazilian President Bolsonaro broke into buildings for Brazil's National Congress, the Supreme Federal Court, and the Planalto Palace. Now, some American politicians are comparing the incident over the weekend to the January 6th Capitol riot.
You can see why they would do that, right? It's easy to dismiss all of these protests as just right wingers going crazy. This is obviously a very zealous group of supporters of Brazil's former leader. They believe that the last election was fraudulent and that those who voted for this extremely left wing called socialist new leader in Brazil bought out the votes of the lower socioeconomic brackets of society. I spoke to a few people in Brazil who say that it is very lopsided, that many people in the country are very much upset about the new leader, and then that's why they're out on the streets. They're trying to make their voices heard. They want a recount. They want things to be fair, and they want a fair election. And we can obviously compare that to what was going on here in the United States as well. So a lot of protests going on in the world, a lot of stories to pay attention to, particularly in terms of this kind of left wing socialist takeover. You can listen to a lot of people that come from socialist countries like Cuba, like Venezuela. I know how you traveled to Cuba. You talked a bit about what you saw there. Talk to them. Obviously they are not happy with the way that things are. They talk about how a society will deteriorate, how an economy will deteriorate with socialist policies, and of course that is what is triggering a lot of these protesters that are out on the streets.
Absolutely. When I talked to some of the locals in Veradero, Cuba, they were telling me about how a lot of the best food and milk doesn't go to the locals, but it always goes to the resorts for the tourists, right? And how they feel so suppressed there, and it's it's definitely a different world, Lisa. Now, Beijing opened its borders as travelers streamed into China by air and sea over the weekend, many eager for long-awaited reunion since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, this followed historic protests against a policy that included frequent testing, curbing movement, and massive lockdowns that heavily damaged the world's second biggest economy.
Right. So yes, it was tremendous levels of repression there for COVID. But when people came out onto the streets, the power of the people, not only were they calling for an end to these COVID policies, but they were also calling for an end to their government. They were calling for the overthrow of Xi Jinping's regime, and that is what perhaps triggered this kind of stepping back and loosening of a lot of these policies, allowing people to travel. Imagine being so tied down and being quarantined for such a long time. They're not even allowing this immunity to happen. So I think we're going to see many more cases. Obviously, we're going to see many more deaths. And a lot of these global health organizations, including the WHO, have said that China is suppressing the numbers, is not allowing us to know exactly what's going on. But the morgues don't have any space. Cemeteries are booked because of the number of COVID deaths that they're experiencing right now. And of course, opening up, they're of course going to see more deaths, but eventually they're going to see that immunity come into play as well.
As the pandemic slowly wraps up, what are we seeing in your neck of the woods in Southern California right now when it comes to masking up and the promotion of more booster shots, perhaps, with the COVID-19 vaccine?
It's a mixed bag. I'm seeing a lot more people wearing masks right now, but that's also because RSV and the flu are very, very deadly this season. And the COVID numbers are up as well. So of course it's winter, it's flu time. We have to live with COVID, right? So in the same breath that we say the flu and RSV this year, we're going to also say COVID every year. So this is something that will just come with the seasons, will come with cold season and all of that. But we're seeing a lot more masking because of that, especially in elderly populations and more sensitive populations. It's mixed here in Southern California because you have a certain segment of the population that is so tied to the concept of boosters and more vaccines and more vaccines and more vaccines, and they're getting their children vaccinated despite the stories about these children athletes and other children, where many children are getting COVID and are okay, meaning that is better to build up that immunity naturally than get the vaccine. But again, I'm not a health official by any means. I'm telling you what I'm observing is that in many segments of the population here, you're still seeing a very, very passionate and zealous group of people still pushing for the boosters. I was invited to a TV screening at one of the Hollywood studios here, and they required not just the vaccinations, the initial two, they required boosters as well. So it's interesting to see that as a requirement to enter an indoor space, while there's many other studies coming out that are kind of going against that. So Mixed bag. I think it's like that everywhere. I know here, obviously, the population is more left and very much in tune with what's going on at the Biden White House and Fauci and all of that. So there you have it. But of course, immunity is doing its job. Nature is doing its job, and of course, a lot of people already having had COVID feel much more comfortable letting their guard down and letting nature do its work.
By the way, before we let you go, Lisa, it was on this day that Apple CEO Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone to the world in San Francisco, and we've seen a lot of versions since then. Do you have an iPhone yourself?
I do. I've had many iPhones. I was one of the last originally to let go of my iPhone because I just love that BlackBerry and being able to type very quickly on it. And I remember getting the iPhone and thinking, I'm making a lot of mistakes on this. It's very the autocorrect, typing on it. But of course, with all the applications and how it makes everything so much easier, I've become fully an Apple person, and every device I have is pretty much Apple.
U.S. correspondent, iPhone lover, and foreign affairs expert Lisa Daftari, thanks so much for joining us today from LA.
My pleasure. Thank you.